month of October of 1962, the world was brought to the brink of annihilation.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The United States was thrown into a panic as Soviet nuclear missiles were spotted on the neighboring island of Cuba. Now instant death was just a short boat ride from Key West, Florida. One wrong move would have resulted in both the United States and the Soviet Union brought to their knees, along with half of the rest of the known world. Fidel Castro, the new dictator of Cuba, had recently announced that Cuba was becoming a communist country and aligning itself with the Soviet Union. Due to Cuba's short distance away from the States, Americans were horrified that communism had made its way to the Western Hemisphere. See, at this point in time, the world was engulfed in a Cold War, where a rivalry between two countries with each their own views on how the people should be governed was all that everybody thought about.
And Elvis Presley, but that's getting off topic.
So when the US saw Cuba becoming communist, they launched an invasion called the Bay of Pigs invasion to dethrone Castro and restore democracy. However, this attempt failed and Cuba became paranoid that the US would attack again. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, public opinion of American President John F. Kennedy was weakening. The Soviet government saw Kennedy as a weak and docile leader, which emboldened them to do something they would never otherwise even consider. When the Cuban government came pleading to the USSR for help against the American tyrants, the Soviets were happy to supply Cuba with secret intermediate-range missiles. These secret missiles were to be installed at a secret facility in Cuba, where the secret operation to set up the secret missiles led by a secret Soviet task force would commence. Secretly. But Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, was hoping that the Americans would discover the missiles. His plan was, when the Americans found out, to offer to remove the missiles without a fight, in return for the USA seceding control of West Berlin to the Soviet Union. For you see, West Berlin was a region of the former capital of Germany. It was a capitalist and democratic city, but unfortunately was surrounded by Soviet-controlled East Germany. While the Soviets loathed the idea that West Berlin remained a democratic state as a pimple on the face of the quote-unquote pristine East Germany, the Soviets would not risk taking it by force. Instead, the Soviets planned to trade West Berlin for the removal of the Soviet missiles from Cuba. Khrushchev's plan started to work as an American scout plane took pictures of a Soviet missile site on Cuba on October 14, 1962. The next day, the photos were confirmed real, and the president was notified. A conference was called to discuss responses to this crisis, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff planned a full invasion. But President Kennedy disagreed. He knew that the balance of power in West Berlin was too fragile to risk a direct approach. Attacking Cuba would give a green light to the Soviets to attack and conquer West Berlin. An invasion would also paint the picture of Americans as trigger-happy cowboys who couldn't solve a fight peacefully, and that was the last thing Kennedy wanted for America. Instead, Kennedy proposed a blockade to surround Cuba and not let any military ships through. However, in case the blockade was attacked, a division of each of the 5 armed forces was sent to Georgia, with the purpose of being as close as possible to Cuba in case of an attack. The military was set to DEFCON 4, and the quarantine began. However, many congressmen opposed Kennedy's blockade and demanded a stronger response. Kennedy replied by agreeing to give a speech concerning the matter on all major domestic televised networks. Before the speech, Kennedy met with the leaders of Canada, Great Britain, West Germany, and France to ask for their support in the coming conflict, to which they all agreed. As Kennedy sat down to begin his speech, everyone in all of the major countries, including Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, listened as the leader of the most powerful nation in the world spoke.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate range ballistic missiles capable of traveling more than twice as far and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru. In addition, jet bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons are now being uncrated and assembled in Cuba, while the necessary air bases are being prepared. The size of this undertaking makes clear that it has been planned for some months. Yet only last month, after I had made clear the distinction between any introduction of ground-to-ground missiles and the existence of defensive anti-aircraft missiles, the Soviet government publicly stated on September 11th that, and I quote, "The armaments and military equipment sent to Cuba are designed exclusively for defensive purposes. The Soviet Union has so powerful rockets to carry these nuclear warheads that there is no need to search for sites for them beyond the boundaries of the Soviet Union," unquote. That statement was false. Neither the United States of America nor the world community of nations can tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation, large or small. We no longer live in a world where only the actual firing of weapons represents a sufficient challenge to a nation's security to constitute maximum peril. Nuclear weapons are so destructive and ballistic missiles are so swift that any substantially increased possibility of their use or any sudden change in their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace. The 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war. This nation is opposed to war. We are also true to our word. Our unswerving objective, therefore, must be to prevent the use of these missiles against this or any other country. We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. Second, I have directed the continued and increased close surveillance of Cuba and its military buildup. The foreign ministers of the OAS, in their communique of October 6, rejected secrecy on such matters in this hemisphere. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. Third, it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. My fellow citizens, let no one doubt that this is a difficult and dangerous effort on which we have set out. The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards, as all paths are, but it is the one most consistent with our character and courage as a nation and our commitments around the world. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you, and good night.
Days later, headlines were published globally about the confidence of the United States. In the Chinese People's Daily, China declared that its entire population will support Cuba in any situation. The Soviet Union gave strict orders to ignore the blockade set by America. However, in Germany, astounded news reporters published their disbelief that this was the same America that failed to gain a mile of ground during their Cuba invasion. Articles all across France expressed unwavering support for America. Even the Catholic Church was impressed, and the Pope cried out to the Soviet Union to listen to Kennedy's reasonable demands. As the blockade went on, the military was raised to DEFCON 2 for the first time in history, and Air Force bombers stood on constant alert, ready to bomb Cuba within 15 minutes of being notified. However, on October 26, a telegram arrived from the Soviet Union, written personally by leader Khrushchev himself. It stated that if this tension kept up, nuclear war would not be far behind. As such, the Soviet Union was open to peace talks with the United States. Finally, on October 27th, the missiles were removed from Cuba in exchange for the removal of the missiles from Italy and Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended just as quickly as it had begun, and the world was safe from nuclear war.